I have held my wife's hand as she left this world, buried her with roses from the garden she loved, and kept her cottage untouched for 3 years as an act of love, so fierce it bordered on religion. So when I drove up that gravel path on a Tuesday afternoon and saw the lights on in a place that was supposed to be dark, I knew, before I even opened that door, that something sacred was about to be violated in a way that would change my family forever. Welcome back to your ultimate destination for gripping revenge stories, family betrayals, shocking betrayals, and emotional justice. Subscribe now and join a community and tell us where you're watching from. Turn on the notification bell for our next story. Are you ready to witness the ultimate payback? Let's get started. I am Mr. ZAHA, and I am 68 years old. Before I tell you what happened at the cottage on Heron Lake Road, I need to tell you about Eleanor. Because without Eleanor, nothing that follows makes any sense. Without Eleanor, the cottage is just a building. Without Eleanor, the betrayal is just a story. With her, with who she was, and what she built, and how thoroughly she loved the people she loved, it becomes something else entirely. Something that cuts to the bone. Eleanor May ZAHA was the kind of woman who made every room she entered feel like it had been waiting for her. Not in a dramatic, attention-commanding way. Eleanor was not a woman who demanded rooms. She was a woman who simply filled them, the way good light fills a space, quietly and completely, until you couldn't imagine the room without it. We met in 1979 at a state fair in Tennessee, of all places, standing in line for funnel cake. She was 22 and laughing at something her friend had said, and the sound of her laugh. I know how this sounds, but I need you to understand it was true. The sound of her laugh was the most real thing I had heard in my 25 years of living. I proposed 14 months later. She said yes before I finished the sentence. We built a life in Charlotte, North Carolina. I had my engineering career. Eleanor had her teaching, 3rd grade, 28 years. Every child she ever taught remembered her. We had 5 children, 5 daughters, each one arriving with their mother's laugh and their father's stubbornness in varying proportions, and each one the best thing we ever did. Lucy, the oldest, who inherited Eleanor's organizational precision and ran a tight household in Richmond. Julianne, the second, who got the laugh most completely and used it like a gift she distributed freely. Susan, the middle child, quiet and perceptive, who saw things the rest of us missed. Margaret, named for Eleanor's grandmother, fierce and direct and incapable of pretense. And Pauline, the youngest, still in her 30s, who had her mother's eyes and her mother's habit of knowing exactly what you needed before you knew it yourself. 5 daughters, and 1 son, Nathaniel. Nathaniel James ZAHA was 41 years old, the 4th of our 6 children, the one boy among 5 girls, born between Margaret and Pauline, who had grown up both indulged and scrutinized in the particular way that the only son in a large family is indulged and scrutinized. He was handsome, genuinely handsome, the kind that photographs well and ages well, and that he was, I'll admit, somewhat aware of. He'd gone into finance, built himself a career in Raleigh that generated the kind of income he wore quietly enough on weekdays and not quite as quietly on weekends. He drove a car that cost more than my first house. He was generous with his family, always the one who picked up the restaurant check, always the one who showed up with something thoughtful at Christmas. He had his mother's warmth and his father's work ethic, and for 41 years I had watched him with the particular pride of a father who sees himself improved upon in his son. He had never married. There had been relationships, several, some serious enough that Eleanor had privately begun knitting in anticipation of grandchildren that never arrived. The women came and went with the gentle frequency of seasons, and Nathaniel seemed, if not entirely content, at least unbothered by the pattern. Eleanor used to say, "He's waiting for someone worth staying for." I used to think she was right. Now let me tell you about the cottage. The cottage on Heron Lake Road was Eleanor's. I say that not in the legal sense. Both our names were on the deed, but in the sense that matters more than deeds. Eleanor had found it, 22 years ago, on a drive we'd taken on a Sunday afternoon with no destination. A small property on the eastern edge of a lake about an hour outside Charlotte. White clapboard siding, green shutters, a porch that ran the full length of the front, and looked out over water that changed color with the light in ways that made Eleanor stop talking mid-sentence and simply stare. She'd turned to me in the car with the expression I'd learned, over decades of marriage, meant something had already been decided. We bought it within the month. Eleanor transformed that cottage. She brought her garden with her, climbing roses on the back fence, hydrangeas along the front walk, a small kitchen herb plot that produced more basil and rosemary than two people could use in a season. She filled the inside with the things that mattered to her: photographs in mismatched frames, quilts she'd made or been given, a rocking chair on the porch that faced the water, the specific color of yellow she'd chosen for the kitchen walls that she claimed made morning light feel like something you could eat. She called it her thinking place. Every summer for 22 years, she spent her mornings on that porch with coffee and her journal, and whatever she worked out there, about life, about herself, about us and our children and the world, she brought back home richer for the working. Eleanor died 3 years ago. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed late, which is the way it usually is with ovarian cancer, and which is a fact I will be quietly angry about for whatever years I have remaining. She was 63. She should have had 30 more years. She should still be on that porch with her coffee. She is not. After she died, I could not bring myself to sell the cottage. My daughters did not push me on it. They understood, each in her own way. I drove out there occasionally, in the first year, and sat on her porch in her rocking chair, and it was the closest I could get to her. I kept everything exactly as she'd left it. Her journal on the side table, her reading glasses on top of the journal, her gardening gloves on the hook by the back door, her yellow kitchen walls. I had one rule about that cottage, and I had stated it once, clearly, to all 6 of my children in the weeks after the funeral. One rule: the cottage was not to be used without my knowledge and my permission. It was not a vacation property for the convenience of whoever needed a weekend getaway. It was their mother's place, and it would be treated accordingly, and anyone who needed to access it for any reason would call me first. They had all agreed. All 6 of them, gathered in my living room in the weeks after we buried Eleanor, had nodded, and some of them had cried, and every one of them had understood exactly what I was asking and why. For 3 years, the rule had held. Until the Tuesday in September when I drove out to Heron Lake Road to check on the property after a neighbor had called to say there'd been some storm activity in the area, and I turned onto the gravel path and saw the lights on inside the cottage. I sat in my car at the end of the path for a moment, looking at those lit windows, and something moved through me that I cannot describe with complete accuracy. It was not simply anger. It was more ancient than anger. It was the particular feeling of a man approaching something that should not be disturbed, something that belonged to someone who was no longer here to protect it, and finding it disturbed anyway. I cut my headlights and drove slowly up the gravel path. There were 2 cars parked alongside the cottage. One I recognized immediately, Nathaniel's car, that expensive machine that cost more than my first house, parked casually in the gravel as though it belonged there. The other car I did not recognize. A silver sedan, a woman's sweater visible through the back window, a pair of sandals on the back seat. I sat in my car and looked at those 2 vehicles for a long time. My blood, as they say, boiled. Not just because of the rule. Not just because my son had brought someone to a place he had no permission to bring anyone. But because of the sweater in the back seat and the sandals and the 2-car evidence of a situation that had clearly been arranged with deliberate thought, which meant it was not an impulse, not a thoughtless moment, but a considered choice. He had brought a woman to his dead mother's cottage. He had made it a destination. I got out of my car. The porch light was on, Eleanor's porch light, the one that illuminated her rocking chair and the path to the front door. I walked toward it through the September evening, and with every step on that gravel, I thought about Eleanor, about her journal on the side table, about her gardening gloves on the hook, about the yellow kitchen walls she'd chosen, because she said morning light should feel like something you could eat. I opened the front door. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments, what do you think Mr. ZAHA found inside that cottage? What would you have done in that moment? The front door of Eleanor's cottage opened the way it always opened, with the particular slight resistance of a door that swells in humidity, the familiar scrape of wood against the threshold, the sound of it that I had heard 1,000 times over 22 years, and that now, in this context, felt like the opening of something that could not be reclosed. The smell hit me first. Not Eleanor's smell, not the lavender and rosemary and old wood and lake air that the cottage always held, that I had preserved across 3 years of careful maintenance. Something different had been layered over it. A woman's perfume, bold and unfamiliar. The smell of cooking. Something had been made in Eleanor's kitchen recently. I could tell from the warm, residual smell of oil and garlic hanging in the air. Wine opened. 2 glasses on Eleanor's coffee table, half full, and the bottle between them on the table surface, without a coaster. Leaving, I noticed with the cold precision of a man cataloging damage, a ring-shaped mark on Eleanor's table. I stood in the doorway, and I took it all in. The lights in the living room were on. The lamp Eleanor had positioned in the corner where it threw the warmest light, the one she read by. Her reading glasses were on the side table where I had left them, but her journal had been moved, pushed to the far edge of the table, out of the way, to make room for the wine bottle and the glasses. The quilt Eleanor had made, the one that had taken her 2 winters to finish, the one made from squares of fabric from things that mattered. A square of Nathaniel's first baseball uniform, a square of Lucy's prom dress, a square of the apron Eleanor had worn for 20 years of Sunday cooking. That quilt had been unfolded from the arm of the chair where I kept it and spread across the couch. Used as a blanket. Used casually, thoughtlessly, as though it were simply soft fabric and not 20 years of a woman's love stitched together by hand. My jaw was tight enough to ache. From the direction of the bedroom came the sound of voices. Low, unhurried, the comfortable murmur of people who believed themselves completely alone. I heard Nathaniel's voice, saying something I couldn't make out, and then a woman's voice responding, lighter, amused, the sound of someone laughing softly at something he'd said. I walked to the bedroom doorway. The door was half open. Nathaniel was sitting on the edge of the bed, Eleanor's bed, the one with the quilt Eleanor had chosen and the iron headboard Eleanor had refinished herself, in the casual posture of someone at home. Shirt untucked, shoes off. On the other side of the room, at Eleanor's vanity mirror, stood a woman I had never seen before. She appeared to be in her mid-30s, attractive, with dark hair and an ease about her bearing that suggested she had been here before. Not tonight. Before. She was looking at herself in Eleanor's mirror, and she had. And this is the detail that crossed whatever internal threshold I had been standing at. She had opened Eleanor's jewelry box. The small inlaid box Eleanor kept on the vanity with the pieces she didn't wear often but couldn't bear to part with. This woman had it open and was holding up a small pearl earring, considering it against her ear in the mirror. Nathaniel saw me first. I watched it happen in his face, the blood leaving it, the instant, complete recognition of what was occurring, the specific horror of a man confronted with a parent in a moment where no version of this ends well. He went from relaxed to rigid in less than a second. Dad, the woman turned. Her expression moved through confusion to startlement to a careful, social composure. She closed the jewelry box, set the earring down, and to her credit, she did not pretend nothing had happened. I looked at my son. I want to describe what I felt in that moment with precision, because it matters that you understand the full composition of it. It was not simply rage, though rage was in it. The particular, clean rage of a man whose sacred things have been touched without permission. It was not simply hurt, though hurt was in it too. The hurt of a father who has trusted a son and found that trust's edge. It was something older and more complicated. It was grief, reactivated. 3 years of careful preservation and deliberate respect for what Eleanor had left behind. And in one evening, one arranged, deliberate, thoughtless evening, the atmosphere of that place had been altered. Not destroyed, but altered. The pearl earring had been lifted by unfamiliar hands. The quilt had been used as casual furniture. The journal had been pushed to the edge to make room for wine. Eleanor was not in this room anymore. Not in the way she had been every other time I'd opened this door. Nathaniel was on his feet now. Dad, I can explain. Don't. The word came out quietly. That was the part that surprised me later, how quiet my voice was. I have always been a man whose anger, when it arrived fully, went cold rather than hot. I get very still. I get very quiet. My children have always found this more frightening than shouting, and I could see from Nathaniel's face that he was finding it frightening now. Sir. The woman spoke, carefully, with a directness that I registered even through my anger as a person choosing not to hide. My name is Diane Whitfield. I want you to know that I didn't. I wasn't aware of the full situation with this property. Nathaniel told me it was a family cottage that the family used. I would not have. She stopped. Looked at the jewelry box. I should not have touched that. I'm sorry. I looked at her. I believed her. Not entirely. She had been here before. Her comfort in the space told me that. but the apology about the jewelry box had the ring of something genuine. She was a person confronting her own behavior honestly, which required a kind of character that I respected even in the worst of moments. "Thank you," I said to her, with the courtesy my mother had installed in me so deeply it operated independently of my emotional state. "I'd appreciate it if you'd give my son and me a few minutes." She gathered her things quickly, with the dignity of a woman who understood exactly what was happening and what she owed the situation. She looked at Nathaniel once, a look that said, clearly, "This is your thing to handle," and she walked past me into the living room. I heard the front door close behind her. Nathaniel and I were alone in Eleanor's bedroom. He was still standing by the bed, hands loose at his sides, which was his tell. Nathaniel put his hands in his pockets when he was defensive and let them hang when he was ashamed. They were hanging. "Dad," he said. "Sit down, Nathaniel." He sat on the edge of the bed, and I stood in the doorway of Eleanor's bedroom, and the cottage was very quiet around us. Outside, through the window above the vanity, I could see the lake. The same lake Eleanor had watched from her porch chair every morning for 22 years, catching the last of the evening light in the way it did that she used to say looked like someone had dropped a handful of coins into the water. "Tell me," I said, "how many times?" He understood the question immediately. He closed his eyes briefly. "5," he said. "Maybe 6. 6 times." He had brought this woman to his mother's cottage 6 times. "Nathaniel." I had to stop, had to recalibrate, because the cold anger was beginning to tip towards something rawer, and I was not prepared to let it. "Not yet. Your mother's jewelry box." I didn't know she was going to. He started, and then stopped himself. "I should have said something. I should have. The whole thing was wrong, Dad. I know that." "What I want to know," I said, moving into the room, sitting down in the small armchair by the window, Eleanor's reading chair, the one she'd positioned to catch the morning lake light, "is what you were thinking. Not the excuses. What you were actually thinking." He looked at his hands. "She died 3 years ago," he said finally. "And sometimes," he stopped, started again, "sometimes this place is the only place I feel close to her." I know that sounds like the worst possible justification. "It does," I said, "and I know it doesn't make it right." He looked up. His eyes, Eleanor's eyes, the same deep brown, the same quality of catching light, were wet. "I brought Diane here because I care about her. Because this is the place that means the most to me. And I didn't stop to think what it meant to use it this way." He paused. "What it meant to Mom's things. What it would mean to you." I sat with that for a long time. The lake light changed in the window. I thought about Eleanor. About what she would say, if she could say anything. About whether she would want the cottage to be the site of a permanent rupture between a father and a son. About whether she would want these walls to hold anger rather than the love that built them. I was not ready to answer those questions yet, but I was beginning to hear them. Nathaniel's explanation just changed things, or did it? What do you think? Was this forgivable or not? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I need to hear from you. I drove home that night without speaking to Nathaniel again. I know that sounds harsh, and perhaps it was, but I need you to understand the specific composition of my silence. It was not punishment. It was not the calculated withdrawal of a father weaponizing quiet to inflict pain. It was simply the fact that I did not yet trust myself to speak. The cold anger had not passed, and underneath it, rising as the shock of the initial discovery began to clear, was something I had not expected to find there: grief. Fresh grief. The kind that had been sleeping for several months, lulled by routine and the small comforts of daily life, and had been abruptly woken by the smell of unfamiliar perfume layered over Eleanor's lavender cottage. I drove home through the September dark, and by the time I turned onto my street in Charlotte, I understood that what I was feeling was not just about Nathaniel. It was about Eleanor. It was about 3 years of keeping things intact, keeping things as she had left them, as though preservation could stand in for presence. As though, if I kept her reading glasses on her journal and her gloves on the hook and her walls their particular yellow, she might not be entirely gone. And now that had been complicated. Someone else's perfume was in those walls. Someone's wine glass had left a ring on Eleanor's table. Someone had held her pearl earring up to the light and seen it as a trinket. I sat in my car in my driveway for 20 minutes before I went inside. The phone call started the next morning. Nathaniel called at 7:15, which told me he had not slept either. I let it go to voicemail. He called again at 9. I let that go too. Not because I was punishing him. I had already said that. Because I needed to think. Because at 68 years old, I have learned that the decisions made in the first 48 hours after something that wounds you are frequently the decisions you spend the most time revising. It was Lucy who called next, which told me Nathaniel had reached out to his sisters. Lucy, who managed situations with the precision of an air traffic controller, called at 10 o'clock with the composed, careful tone of a woman who had been briefed and was now executing a plan. "Daddy," she said, "I heard what happened." "Did you?" Nathaniel called me. Daddy, he's not handling it well." "Neither am I," I said, which seemed to surprise her. Lucy was accustomed to her father being the stable architecture in the room, the load-bearing wall. I heard her recalibrate on the other end of the line. "I know," she said more softly. "I know you're not. And I'm not going to tell you you should be fine with it. What he did was wrong. He broke your trust. He broke the rule about the cottage, and," she paused, "and he should have known better. He did know better. That's the part that's hardest." "Yes," I said. "That is the part that's hardest." By noon, I had heard from Julianne and Susan. Julianne, characteristically, was furious on my behalf. She had her mother's warmth, but when it tipped past its boundary, it became a fire, and she was burning on my behalf with impressive intensity. "He had no right, Daddy. That place is sacred. Mama's things are sacred. I want to call him myself and—" "Don't," I said. "Let me handle this." Susan called last of the three, and Susan, always the quiet one, always the one who saw what others missed, did not begin with an opinion. She asked, simply, "How are you actually feeling?" Not what you think you should feel. Actually, it was the right question. It was so precisely the right question that I had to sit down. "Like I lost her again," I said. "A little. Today." Susan was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's what I thought. Daddy, can I come over tomorrow?" She came the next morning, and she brought coffee, and she sat across from me at my kitchen table, and she said something that I had not yet allowed myself to consider fully. "Nathaniel's been struggling since Mama died," she said. "More than he's shown. More than any of us knew." I looked at her. "He doesn't talk about it," Susan continued. "He's the only boy. He grew up feeling responsible for all of you, for you and Mama both, in the way he had it in his head. When she died, he didn't grieve the way the rest of us did. He didn't cry at the funeral. He was the one managing things, calling vendors, coordinating the reception. He was the one making sure everyone else was okay." She paused. "I think he's been holding something that he doesn't have any outlet for." I turned my coffee cup in my hands. "That's not an excuse for what he did." "No," she said immediately. "It's not. I'm not offering it as one. I'm telling you because I think when you talk to him again, and you will talk to him again, it matters that you know there's more underneath it than thoughtlessness." I thought about that for the remainder of that day and into the next. About Nathaniel at the funeral. Yes, I could picture it. The composure, the task orientation, the way he had placed himself between me and the logistics of loss so that I didn't have to manage them. I had been grateful for it. I had not, I realized with the particular guilt of retrospect, looked closely enough at what it cost him. On the third day, Margaret called. Margaret was always the last because she thought the longest before she spoke. She processed things the way you process hardwood, slowly and with friction, until the truth emerged smooth. She said, "Daddy, I want to tell you something, and I need you to hear me out before you respond." I said I was listening. "Nathaniel told me why he took her there," Margaret said. "He told me what he told you, that it was the place where he feels closest to Mama. But he also told me something he didn't tell you, because he was too ashamed." A pause. "He told me he's been considering asking Diane to marry him, and that he brought her to the cottage because he wanted her to know Mama, because there's no other way to let her know Mama, and the cottage was the closest he could find to that." I sat with that for a long time. "He should have asked me," I said. "He should have," Margaret agreed. "He's a grown man of 41 who was afraid of his father and made a foolish, loving choice." Both of those things are true simultaneously. Afraid of my father. I turned that over. Was that true? Was Nathaniel, at 41 years old, still navigating around the architecture of my approval in ways that led him to make decisions in secret rather than ask permission for things that mattered to him? Was that partly the inheritance of how I had raised him? I did not like that question. I sat with it anyway, because I have found, at 68, that the questions you don't like are usually the most important ones. Pauline called on the fourth day. Pauline, the youngest, who had Eleanor's eyes and Eleanor's habit of knowing what you needed. She did not lead with Nathaniel. She She led with me. "Daddy," she said, "when's the last time you actually let yourself be sad about Mama? Not the maintenance sadness of missing her every day. The real, big, sit down and cry sadness." I told her I didn't know what she meant. She told me she thought I did. I sat in my kitchen after I hung up with Pauline, and I thought about Eleanor's journal on that side table. About the fact that I had preserved that cottage for 3 years not just for Eleanor, but for myself. For the version of myself that could go there and sit in her rocking chair and be close to her. About whether that preservation had tipped, somewhere along the line, from honoring her to something else. Something that was more about me than about her. About whether a cottage, a building, beautiful and beloved as it was, should be carrying the entire weight of keeping her memory alive. About whether Eleanor herself, who had been generous and warm and whose love was never exclusionary, would have wanted her cottage to be a locked reliquary. Or whether she would have wanted it to be what she'd always made it, a place of welcome, a thinking place, a place where things got worked out. I picked up my phone. I called Nathaniel. This story just turned a corner I didn't see coming. Did you? Tell me in the comments. What do you think Mr. ZAHA is about to say to Nathaniel? What should he say? He answered on the first ring. That told me something. That told me he had been carrying his phone with him for 4 days, waiting for it. I could hear it in the quality of his answer. The breath he took before speaking, the controlled steadiness of a man who had prepared for this, and was discovering that preparation and readiness are not the same thing. "Dad, come over," I said. "Tonight. I'll make dinner." A silence. Then, "Okay." I cooked that evening with a deliberateness that I recognized as its own kind of preparation. I made pot roast, Eleanor's recipe, the one she'd made every Sunday for 30 years, the one I'd learned from watching her so carefully that I had it memorized down to the timing of when to add the rosemary. My daughters used to say that when I cooked the pot roast the house smelled like Sunday mornings and everything being all right. I don't know if that was true or whether they were simply being kind. But I made it that night because it was the meal that felt most like Eleanor in my kitchen, and I needed her in the room for this conversation. Nathaniel arrived at 6:30. He looked, and I will not soften this, he looked like a man who had not slept well in 4 days. There were shadows under his eyes that I recognized because I had seen them in my own mirror. He had his mother's eyes, and right now they were carrying the specific exhaustion of a person who has been living inside regret, which is a heavier residence than most. He stood in the doorway of my kitchen, still in his work clothes, and he looked at the pot roast on the stove, and something moved across his face that he didn't manage to contain in time. His jaw tightened, the way mine does when I am trying to keep something inside. "Sit down," I said. "It's not ready yet." He sat at the kitchen table. I stood at the stove with my back to him, and I spoke first. "Your sister Margaret told me what she told me," I said. "About Diane. About why you took her there." I heard him shift in his chair. "I want to hear it from you," I said. "Not from your sister's version of it. I want you to say it." A long pause. "I've been seeing Diane for 18 months, he said, his voice steadier than I expected. Dad, she's the one. I know I've said things like that before and it didn't hold, but this is different and I know the difference because Mom taught me what it looks like." He paused. "She taught me what it looks like when someone just fits. When someone makes the room feel right." I kept stirring. "I wanted Diane to know Mom," he continued. I know Mom's gone, and I know there's no way to actually make that happen. But the cottage is where I feel her most. It's where I hear her voice the clearest in my head. When I'm on that porch, I can hear her laughing. I can hear exactly what she would say about the light on the water." His voice thinned slightly. "I wanted Diane in that place because I wanted the closest thing I could find to an introduction. I wanted Mom to know her." I set down the stirring spoon. I turned around. He was looking at his hands on the table. The same posture, hands loose, not in pockets, that had told me he was ashamed in the cottage bedroom 4 days ago. But underneath the shame, now that I was looking with the eyes of a father who had spent 4 days gathering more information, I could see what Susan had described. The grief he hadn't processed. The weight he'd been holding in the composed, task-oriented, eldest son in spirit way that he'd held it since the funeral. I pulled out the chair across from him and I sat down. "Look at me, Nathaniel." He looked up. "When your mother died," I said, "you didn't fall apart. Do you remember that? Everyone else did, one way or another. Lucy took a week off work and didn't leave the house. Julian cried at the grocery store for 3 months. She told me that later. Susan and Margaret both went to therapy. Pauline called me every night for 6 months. I paused. You arranged the funeral. You called the vendors. You stood at that reception and shook every single hand and made sure I didn't have to manage anything. And then you went back to Raleigh and you went back to work. He was very still. I was grateful for it, I said. At the time I was so deep in my own grief that I was grateful you were functional. That was selfish of me. I stopped. Let that sit for a moment. I should have looked harder at what it was costing you. Dad, I'm not done. I leaned forward slightly. I've been keeping that cottage the way I've been keeping it because I needed somewhere to put Eleanor. To put the version of her that I'm not ready to only have in photographs and memories. I needed a room where she still existed in 3 dimensions. And it served its purpose. It's kept me sane, more or less. But I've also been holding it so tightly that I made it into something it was never meant to be. I paused. Your mother was not a woman who made locked rooms. She made open ones. She made places where people were welcome. That was the whole point of her. He was very still. His eyes were wet. You should have asked me, Nathaniel. My voice steady. You should have called me and said, Dad, I've met someone important and I want her to know where Mom lived her best mornings. Can we come out together? That's what you should have done. I know, he said, barely audible. You were afraid I'd say no. He didn't answer, which was itself an answer. Would I have said no? I asked. If you'd come to me and told me what you just told me, that she's the one, that you wanted an introduction, that you wanted to bring her to the cottage because you wanted Mom to know her, would I have said no to that? He looked at me for a long time. I didn't know, he said quietly. No, I said. You didn't. Because we have not had that kind of conversation since your mother died. And that's on both of us. I leaned back. You stopped letting me see how you were doing, and I stopped pushing to see it. And we've been living in that gap for 3 years. The kitchen was quiet. The pot roast smelled like Sunday mornings and everything being all right. The jewelry box, I said. He flinched. She did that herself, he said. I didn't know she was going to. I should have said something to her about the things in there. I should have told her. He pressed his hands flat on the table. I'm so sorry, Dad. Not just the sorry of getting caught. I need you to know that. It was wrong to use that place the way I did. Wrong to let Mom's things be, to not protect them the way you asked us to. It was wrong, and I am genuinely sorry. I looked at my son. I looked at the 41-year-old man across my kitchen table with his mother's eyes and his father's hands, and 3 years of unprocessed grief sitting in the shadows under his eyes, and I thought about Eleanor. About what she would say if she were in this kitchen right now, standing at the stove where I had stood, watching this conversation. She would say, he's your boy, ZAHA. He did a foolish thing for a loving reason. Now what are you going to do about it? I want to meet Diane, I said. Nathaniel blinked. Properly, I said. Not the way I met her 4 days ago. I want you to bring her to dinner. Here. And I want to hear about who she is from both of you, not just from the situation. I paused. And then, when that goes well, I want us to go to the cottage together. All of us. You, me, Diane, your sisters. I want to open that place the way your mother always intended it to be opened. With family. With people who matter. He was quiet for a long moment. Something was moving through his face. Through the exhaustion and the shame and the grief, something else was coming up. Something that looked, slowly and tentatively, like relief. And Nathaniel. I waited until he was looking at me fully. If you are going to ask this woman to marry you, and it sounds like you should, and soon, I want to be the first person you tell. Not the last. The first. Your mother would have insisted on it, and I'm insisting on it in her absence. He put his face in his hands. Not dramatically. Not performatively. Just a man of 41 who had been holding something very large for a very long time, and who had just been handed permission to set it down. His shoulders moved once, twice. I let him have it. I did not look away, and I did not offer false comfort, and I did not fill the silence with noise. I just sat there, across the table from my son, and I let him feel what he'd been not feeling for 3 years, because he was safe enough now to feel it, because we were finally talking. After a while he looked up. His eyes were red. He looked, in that moment, younger, not the 41-year-old finance professional, but the boy I'd taught to ride a bike in this neighborhood, the boy who'd cried at the end of every summer because he didn't want to leave the cottage. She would have liked Diane, he said. Mom. She would have really liked her. Tell me why, I said. And he did. Over pot roast that tasted like Sunday mornings, he told me about Diane, who she was, what she did, how they'd met, what she made him feel, what she'd said when he told her, last week, about Eleanor. He talked for an hour, and I listened for an hour, and it was the longest real conversation we'd had since before Eleanor died, and every minute of it was something we had both been missing without knowing exactly how to name what was missing. Father and son, finally talking after 3 years of silence. I am not okay. Are you? Tell me in the comments what this scene meant to you. What did Mr. ZAHA do right? Diane Whitfield came to dinner 2 weeks later. I want to tell you about that evening because it matters, and because my daughters deserve to be in this story the way they were in this chapter of my life. Fully, loudly, warmly, the way 5 sisters fill a room when they arrive together for a family dinner, and the kitchen can barely contain the noise and the love of it. They came, all 5 of them. Lucy, organized and warm and carrying the good wine she'd researched carefully because of course she had. Julianne, who had redirected her fire once she'd processed things, and arrived with a casserole and a readiness to give Diane a fair chance, because that was who Julianne was under the fire. Susan, quiet and perceptive, watching everything and missing nothing. Margaret, who had said what needed saying and arrived with the easy confidence of a person who has done their job well. And Pauline, youngest, who had her mother's eyes and walked through my front door, hugged me for a long moment, and whispered, "You did good, Daddy." Diane arrived with Nathaniel, and she brought flowers, an armful of mixed late summer garden flowers, informal and abundant, the kind you don't buy from a florist but from a farm stand. She handed them to me at the door and said, "Mr. ZAHA, I want to start over from the beginning if that's something you'd allow." I looked at her, at this woman my son had loved quietly for 18 months, who had held a pearl earring up to a mirror in a dead woman's cottage and then apologized for it with a genuineness I had believed. I looked at the farm stand flowers and I looked at her direct, steady eyes and I thought about what Nathaniel had said over pot roast. She would have really liked Diane. "Come in," I said. She came in. The dinner was everything a family dinner should be, which means it was loud and overlapping and occasionally chaotic and suffused with the particular warm electricity of people who love each other and are glad to be in the same room. Julianne put Diane through an informal interview that masqueraded as conversation. She was not subtle about it, but she was warm, and Diane held her own with a humor and directness that won Julianne over inside 20 minutes, which is a significant achievement because Julianne's standard for the people who entered her brother's life had always been high. Lucy analyzed Diane quietly from her end of the table, and I could see the progressive softening of Lucy's assessment as the evening went on. Susan watched everything and at one point caught my eye from across the table and gave me a look that said, clearly, without a word, "She's good, Daddy." "She's really good." Margaret asked Diane, somewhere in the middle of the main course, what she knew about Eleanor. Not challengingly, genuinely. What had Nathaniel told her? Diane set down her fork and thought about that with a seriousness that silenced the table briefly. "He told me she laughed loud enough to fill a room," she said. "That she could tell when anyone was hurting before they said a word. That she made the cottage yellow because she believed light should feel like something you could eat." She paused. "And that he hopes, someday, I'll be half the person she was." She looked at me across the table. "I think that's the most loving thing I've ever heard a son say about his mother." The table was quiet for a moment. Then Julianne, who was not a woman who cried easily, pressed her lips together and reached across and squeezed Diane's hand. The cottage trip happened on a Saturday in October, 3 weeks after the dinner. Nathaniel had called me the week before with a formality in his voice that told me he had prepared for the call. "Dad," he said, "I asked Diane to marry me last night." I sat down. She said yes. I sat with that for a moment, with the fullness of it. My son, 41 years old, who had brought an armful of farm stand flowers to my door and spent 18 months quietly loving a woman who was worth the loving and who had waited, with more patience than most people manage, for him to find his way to saying it. "First person?" I asked. "First person," he said. I could hear him smiling. "Congratulations, son," I said. "Bring her to the cottage on Saturday." All 7 of us drove out to Heron Lake Road on a Saturday morning when October was doing its particular best, the light low in gold, the lake reflecting it with the coin-scattered shimmer that Eleanor had watched from her porch chair every morning for 22 years. The leaves were turning. The hydrangeas along the front walk, which I had maintained through 3 years of careful tending, had made their last color of the season. I unlocked the front door and opened it, and I stood back and let my children in. Let them in the way Eleanor would have opened it. Widely, without ceremony. The way you open a door when the people coming through it are people you love, and the whole point of the place is that they should be in it. Nathaniel went in last, with Diane beside him. I followed them. The cottage smelled like itself again. I had come out 2 weeks prior and done what needed doing. Washed the wine ring off Eleanor's table, refolded her quilt, restored her journal to its place. Not erasing Diane's presence. That was not the point, and would not have been Eleanor's point. But returning the things that mattered to their proper relationships with each other. The reading glasses on the journal. The gloves on the hook. The yellow walls in their morning light. I went to Eleanor's kitchen and I made coffee, the way Eleanor made it, stronger than most people made it. In the old stovetop percolator she'd refused to replace with anything modern. The sound of it filled the cottage, and with the sound of it the smell, and with the smell something I had not expected arrived. The particular, physical sensation of Eleanor being close. Not present. I am 68 years old, and I have buried too many people to confuse memory with presence. But close. The way someone is close when everything around you holds the shape of their love. Pauline came to stand beside me at the kitchen counter. She leaned her head against my shoulder for a moment. Just a moment, the way she had as a child. She's here, she said quietly. You can feel her, can't you? Yes, I said. Good, Pauline said. That's what the cottage is for. On the porch, through the window above the kitchen sink, I could see my children arranged in the way families arrange themselves naturally when they are comfortable. Julianne and Susan in the chairs, Lucy standing at the porch rail looking at the water, Margaret on the steps. Nathaniel in Eleanor's rocking chair, which I had not been able to look at for a long time and which now, with him in it, looked exactly as it should look, occupied, inhabited, alive. Diane beside him, her hand in his, looking out at the same water that Eleanor had watched every morning and said looked like someone had dropped a handful of coins into. I watched my son show his future wife the lake his mother loved, in the chair his mother sat in, on the porch his mother built her mornings on, and I felt something that I have been trying to find the right word for since that morning. It was not grief. It was not simple happiness. It was something that only exists in the space between those two things, something that I can only describe as the feeling of a thing continuing, of love not ending but transmitting, of Eleanor, who had always made people feel welcome in her rooms, welcoming this new person into the continuing life of her family. I brought the coffee out. We sat on that porch all morning, 7 of us. 8, if you count the one we felt without seeing, and we talked about everything and nothing, the way families do when they are simply, gratefully, together. The lake did its October business with the light. The hydrangeas finished their season with quiet dignity. Somewhere on the water a heron stood on a submerged rock and regarded us without concern, and Diane pointed at it and said, quietly, "Look." And we all looked, and for a moment none of us said anything. Mom used to say the herons were the lake's way of paying attention, Pauline said. Diane looked at the heron for a long moment. I like that very much, she said. Nathaniel looked at me across the assembled mourning of his family, and I looked back at my son, and neither of us said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. I am Mr. ZAHA. I am 68 years old. I forgot something once. No, wait. That is not right. This story is not about forgetting. This story is about finding. I found my son in a place he should not have been, and I found, underneath the anger of that discovery, something I had not known was lost, the conversation we had stopped having, the grief he had been carrying alone, the gap between us that had grown, quietly and without announcement, in the years since Eleanor left. And I found, in the closing of that gap, the particular truth that Eleanor spent her whole life demonstrating, that love does not preserve by remaining unchanged. It preserves by continuing to move, by opening rather than closing, by welcoming the new into the shape of what was. Her cottage is not a reliquary. It is a living room. And on an October morning with coffee and 7 people and a heron paying attention on the water, it was, fully, finally, as she had always intended, home. Some things you don't preserve by keeping them still. You preserve them by letting them love forward. If this story stayed with you, if something in Mr. ZAHA's journey, Nathaniel's quiet grief, or that final morning on the porch moved you in a way you want to express, please leave a comment below. Tell me which moment got you the most. Tell me what it made you think about your own family, your own sacred places, your own conversations that need to happen before it's too late. Your comments are what keep these stories alive. Thank you for reading every word. Thank you so much for watching my story all the way to the end. Your support means everything. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.